"You locked my kids in the clubhouse," I repeated slowly, holding the phone against my ear with one hand while the other gripped my steering wheel in white-knuckled disbelief. "Well, maybe next time you'll want to check the building before you go home for your Wine and Bravo reruns, because what you just did, that's called false imprisonment. And I hope you're sitting down, Karen, because I'm the Attorney General of this state." The line went dead for a beat. Then I heard a muffled gasp. That was the moment I knew the game had changed. No more smug power trips, no more HOA tantrums, and definitely no more locked doors. Karen had just picked a legal fight with the last person she ever should have messed with, and it started with my kids being treated like afterthoughts. The day had started with nothing more dramatic than a missing shoe and spilled juice. It was a Saturday, and my two kids, Ellie and Max, had been buzzing all morning about the birthday party at the HOA-run clubhouse. It was for their friend Zoe, a sweet kid whose mom had rented the space for a few hours to host a backyard-style party indoors. They had cupcakes, balloon animals, a magician that suspiciously resembled a retired DMV worker, and a Bluetooth speaker blasting kid-friendly pop music that made your ears bleed a little. But the kids loved it. I dropped them off at noon and stayed long enough to say hello, then headed to the store to grab groceries and a few things for our barbecue the next day. It was sometime around 3:40 when I got the call. Ellie's voice was hushed and shaky. She sounded like she was crouched in a closet. "Daddy," she whispered, "the party ended and everyone left, but the doors won't open, and the lights are off. We're still inside. Max is trying to open the back window, but it's stuck." I froze in the middle of the produce aisle, my heart thudding once, loud enough to block out the sound of cartwheels squeaking past. I asked her where the adults were, and she said they had all left. The clubhouse manager, Karen, had said it was time to close and just walked out after flipping the lights off. I asked if there was an emergency exit, and Ellie said it was locked with a chain and padlock. My first thought was to stay calm. My second was to get there now. I left the cart where it was, sprinted out of the store, and broke at least 3 traffic laws getting to the clubhouse. It sat near the edge of the community, a one-story brick building that always looked like it was trying too hard to be fancy, with false columns and a heavy wooden door that stuck in the heat. I parked diagonally across 2 spaces and leaped out. The front door was deadbolted. I banged on it. Nothing. I ran to the side and found a window. I could barely see movement. 2 small shadows huddled near the juice-stained party table. I shouted, "Max, wave." I called Karen. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice dripping with indifference. "Yes, what is it?" I told her, "My kids are locked in the clubhouse." Her response was an exasperated sigh. "Well, if they didn't come out with the rest of the kids, that's not my fault. I closed the building at 4:00. It's the rules." I kept my voice level. "You didn't check." She said, "I don't have time to babysit every little brat who wants to hide in a corner. Maybe next time your kids will learn to follow the rules." That's when I dropped the line, the one that made her future unravel faster than she could hang up. I could hear the sharp inhale before she slammed the line shut. I immediately dialed local police and gave a brief explanation. They said a unit would arrive when available. That wasn't good enough. I walked back to the door and told the kids to stand back. Then I pulled out the emergency rescue tool I kept in my trunk and went to work on the weak hinge of the clubhouse's back door. 3 kicks, a wedge of metal, and the door gave way with a crack. Ellie and Max stumbled into my arms like they'd just escaped a haunted house. As I walked them to the car, a few neighbors who'd seen the commotion began to gather. One of them was an elderly man named Walter who mowed his lawn like it was a sacred ritual. He muttered that Karen had been a pain since the day she joined the board. I said nothing, just buckled my kids in and called my assistant from the car. "Document everything," I said. This just turned into a legal matter. 15 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, one looking skeptical, the other curious. As they approached, I introduced myself and handed them my card. The skeptical one blinked, looked down at it, then back at me. "Oh," he said. "Oh." They took my statement with new energy. One of them even offered my kids a pair of junior deputy stickers. I declined, but Ellie whispered that it would be good to have official proof she wasn't the one who broke the door. As they headed toward the clubhouse, Karen reappeared, probably having been alerted by a neighbor or her own guilty conscience. She stormed up in full Karen mode, pastel windbreaker flapping, phone in hand like a badge of war. "He broke into HOA property. I want him arrested," she shouted. The skeptical cop turned toward her and said dryly, "Ma'am, the Attorney General has full legal authority to act in cases of unlawful detainment, especially involving minors. You should be calling your lawyer." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked like a fish dropped onto hot pavement. "But they were just kids," she squeaked. "It was only for a few minutes." I said nothing. The officer said, "Actually, it was almost 45 minutes based on the daughter's call log, and they were locked in the dark. No one accounted for them." "That's serious." The crowd around us grew. Someone started filming. Karen turned pale, her phone wobbling in her hand. She tried to spin around and leave, but the officer gently touched her arm and said, "I'm going to need you to stay and answer some questions." That was when I knew this wasn't just going to be a personal matter anymore. This was the start of something much, much bigger. And Karen? She was about to find out exactly what happens when a petty HOA dictator plays legal roulette with the wrong man's family. Karen didn't go down quietly. After her humiliation outside the clubhouse, she was escorted back inside by the officers and asked to give a formal statement. I stood near my car with my kids, letting them snack on crackers while watching cartoons on a tablet. It was surreal, like watching a poorly written sitcom where the neighborhood villain gets caught. In real life, I wasn't planning on turning this into a public spectacle, but Karen's arrogance had pushed the boundaries. What she didn't realize yet was that her actions weren't just negligent, they were illegal. And worse for her, they were personal. Not because she messed with me, but because she involved my children in her warped version of power. As the officers left with copies of the clubhouse key logs, security footage, and the building's access schedule, I overheard one of them mutter, "That woman's cook." Later that evening, I sat with my wife, Vanessa, explaining everything in detail. She was calmer than I expected, but only because she was used to hearing about legal insanity from my job. What rattled her was the fact that our kids had been locked in a dark, empty building while the person responsible smirked and walked away. "She knew they were in there," she said softly. "You saw the cameras?" I nodded. One of the officers had shown me a brief clip, grainy but clear. Karen had walked by the window where Ellie was waving. She either ignored it or didn't care. Either option was damning. The next morning, I submitted the first formal report through the proper channels. As Attorney General, I had to maintain the same procedure I would demand from others: neutral, methodical, thorough. But I also had more tools at my disposal. I didn't intend to abuse them. I didn't need to. Karen had gift-wrapped this case with her arrogance. My office launched a preliminary review to assess whether any criminal charges could be pursued, ranging from child endangerment to unlawful detainment. Simultaneously, I drafted a letter to the HOA board requesting an emergency hearing about the incident, not as a government official, just as a parent and resident. The HOA board was made up of 6 people. Karen had ruled over them like a queen for nearly 5 years, getting reelected mostly because no one else wanted the job and she was aggressive enough to keep challengers away. But her reign was far from stable. I'd heard whispers at neighborhood events, people grumbling about her constant fines, passive-aggressive emails, her habit of issuing threats disguised as friendly reminders. The board members were tired. They just needed a reason to stand up, and Karen had handed them one. When I walked into the emergency HOA meeting 3 days later, I could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface. The community room was packed. More than 50 residents had shown up. Karen sat at the head of the table in her usual pastel blouse, lips pursed, a binder clutched in her lap like a shield. Her eyes flicked up to me as I entered. There was no smile, just barely concealed contempt. She wasn't afraid yet. She still believed this could be spun. She cleared her throat and opened the meeting with her usual robotic voice. "We're gathered today to address some confusion regarding the clubhouse's closure procedures. I would like to make clear that no harm was intended and all proper policies were followed. A few heads in the audience tilted. Karen continued, "The children in question chose to remain inside after the scheduled party concluded. Staff had completed their responsibilities and secured the premises according to posted signage and standard policy." I didn't interrupt. I wanted her to keep talking. Vice President Derek, a retired engineer with a fondness for Hawaiian shirts, raised his hand. "Karen, you said staff secured the premises, but weren't you the only one working that day?" She blinked, then nodded. "Yes, but as the acting clubhouse manager, I am staff." Derek pressed on. "So you locked the doors yourself?" Her tone sharpened. "Yes, as is protocol. I cannot be responsible for minors hiding in corners. That was when I stood. I wasn't there to grandstand, but I wasn't going to let her rewrite the truth either. I introduced myself plainly, not using my title. I'm the father of the 2 kids Karen locked inside the clubhouse. I want to make something clear. They didn't hide. They were visible from the window. My daughter called me in tears, and Karen's own security footage confirmed she walked past them while locking up." A collective murmur rolled through the room. Karen sputtered, "That footage is blurry. It's not conclusive, and those kids weren't supposed to be there." I turned to the crowd and calmly said, "They were attending a birthday party that was properly scheduled and registered. The children were supposed to be there, and as per HOA rules, the clubhouse manager must confirm the building is empty before locking up." A woman in the back raised her hand. "Is that actually in the rules?" I smiled slightly. "Page 6 of the Clubhouse Operations Manual. I reviewed it this morning." Derek cleared his throat again. "Actually, I pulled a copy too. It's there. Clause 4.2. All facilities must be checked for occupants before closure." Karen paled. I didn't need to say anything else. The meeting took a sharp turn. One by one, residents began voicing concerns, some angry, some confused, some scared. Stories spilled out. Someone's dog had been threatened with expulsion for barking. Another resident had their garden torn out because the plants were visually inconsistent. One parent said Karen fined her for letting her toddler use chalk on the driveway. It was like a dam had broken. Karen tried to regain control. She raised her voice, banged her binder on the table, accused everyone of ganging up on her. But it didn't work. When Sarah, the board's secretary and longtime community volunteer, stood up and said, "We need a vote of no confidence," the room erupted in applause. Karen slammed her binder shut and stormed out. But the damage was already done. Later that night, I sat with Ellie and Max, telling them how proud I was of how brave they'd been. Max asked if Karen was going to jail. I told him the law takes time, but what mattered was that she couldn't hurt anyone else for now. Ellie asked if she could go to the clubhouse again. I hesitated, then nodded. "Soon," I said, "but next time we'll make sure it's safe, and maybe with better people in charge." Outside, porch lights flicked on across the neighborhood like a slow wave of calm. It felt like something had shifted, not just in our household, but across the entire community. Karen had ruled through fear and manipulation for years, but in one foolish moment, she made it personal. And now the law was coming, not with sirens and flashbangs, but with quiet, unrelenting precision. The next few days moved quickly but quietly, like the moment just before a storm hit. While Karen tried to disappear from public view, the fallout from the clubhouse incident only deepened. What she likely assumed would be a slap-on-the-wrist confrontation had now escalated into a formal investigation led by multiple branches. I made sure to separate my personal anger from professional duty, but I wasn't going to sit idle while a petty tyrant who endangered kids tried to walk away clean. The moment she locked that door without checking, she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and I was going to ensure that the legal process did its work, thoroughly and fairly, but with consequences she couldn't manipulate away. My office issued an internal review and referred the case to an independent ethics counsel to prevent any claims of bias. Meanwhile, local law enforcement obtained a warrant to retrieve all surveillance footage, staff communications, and access logs from the clubhouse. Karen had been using a community-issued device to manage her clubhouse duties. Unfortunately for her, it included emails, message logs, and a calendar that revealed a troubling pattern. She'd locked up Hurley several times before, despite event schedules running later. There was even a note from 2 months prior about leaving early on Sundays to beat the rush at the wine bar. None of these prior incidents had resulted in anything serious, until now. Now, with children involved and security footage backing their story, there was no sweeping this under the rug. Predictably, Karen attempted damage control. She sent out a community-wide email dripping with manufactured regret, claiming she never meant to upset anyone and that protocol confusion was to blame. She referred to the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding and expressed hope that the matter could be put to rest peacefully. But no one was buying it anymore, not after people saw the footage, not after they heard firsthand that 2 kids were trapped inside a locked building while the so-called Clubhouse manager walked away without a glance behind her. Her words came off as hollow, defensive, and rehearsed. It only fueled more anger. What Karen didn't expect was that her critics had receipts. Residents began pulling old emails, printed notices, and security complaint logs. One woman even posted on the neighborhood app a photo of her daughter crying outside the clubhouse last summer. Apparently, Karen had closed early that day too, locking out a family reunion halfway through cleanup. No one had spoken up before because they feared retaliation. Karen had been known to impose fines for things as petty as incomplete grass edging and unauthorized flower pots. But now that she was under fire, those fears began to shrink. To make things worse for her, a local news outlet caught wind of the story after a video clip from the HOA meeting went viral. It showed Karen slamming her binder shut while neighbors shouted over her. The headline read, "HOA leader under fire for locking children inside clubhouse. Attorney General's kids among victims." The article painted a damning picture of Karen's reign and included first-hand quotes from residents who had felt intimidated for years. The news hit like a wave, washing away any last shred of control Karen had. Her reputation was now shredded far beyond the borders of our neighborhood. Behind the scenes, my office prepared a civil liability review. While criminal charges would depend on the county prosecutor and the final report from law enforcement, there was already enough to begin the process of seeking damages. Not because I wanted to profit off the incident. I didn't need the money. What I wanted was formal accountability. I wanted the record to reflect what happened, and I wanted that record to follow Karen wherever she tried to run next. Then came the HOA audit. With Karen under scrutiny, the board decided to bring in an independent review of financial records, something residents had requested for years and always been denied. Within 48 hours, the preliminary findings were enough to make everyone sit up straighter. Karen had approved upgrades to the clubhouse that weren't in the budget. She'd reimbursed herself for administrative supplies that included cosmetic items, brand-name clothing, and what appeared to be a full set of custom luggage. Receipts were missing. Funds had been shuffled between accounts without proper oversight. The board froze all HOA discretionary spending pending a full investigation. Karen tried to claim it was a smear campaign, but no one was listening anymore. A few days after the audit started, Karen's husband was seen packing boxes into the back of their SUV. Rumors swirled that they were planning to leave town. That was fine by me. She could run, but she wouldn't outrun the law. I didn't need her to live in shame. I just needed her to understand that some positions of power come with responsibility, not entitlement. You don't get to play warden with other people's children and then shrug it off as a scheduling hiccup. Especially not when those children happen to be mine. I spoke once more with the parents of the birthday girl, Zoe. They were mortified, blaming themselves even though they had no way of knowing what Karen would do. They'd followed the correct rental process, assumed the clubhouse manager would check before locking up, and left with the belief all kids had exited. Zoe's mom teared up during our conversation. I reassured her, told her no blame belonged to her. This wasn't about one birthday party gone wrong. This was about a pattern of negligent behavior finally colliding with someone who had the legal means to expose it. At home, things slowly returned to normal for my kids. Max started joking about how Dad kicked down a door like a superhero. Ellie, ever the more serious one, said she had a nightmare that Karen came back and locked her inside our pantry. Vanessa and I made sure they knew they were safe, that no one would ever get away with mistreating them. And I reminded them that even when someone does something wrong, we don't fight back with screaming. We fight back with truth, with proof, and with calm strength. The look on Karen's face when she realized who I was had taught them more about consequences than any lecture could. By the end of the week, Karen was suspended indefinitely from the HOA pending formal review. A special election was scheduled to replace her. In the meantime, the clubhouse remained closed for safety inspections. I watched the changes from a distance, never interfering, never grandstanding. I had no interest in being the neighborhood hero. I just wanted to make sure no other child had to cry into a phone in the dark, hoping their parent could somehow make a locked door disappear. And Karen? Her silence spoke volumes. No apology, no accountability, just a quiet retreat behind drawn blinds and the rustle of moving boxes. But that was fine, because the law wasn't finished with her yet, and I had no intention of letting this end with just embarrassment. There were charges on the table and more discoveries waiting in the audit. If she thought locking a door would shut people up, she was about to learn that sometimes opening the wrong door invites a storm that never stops knocking. The emergency election to replace Karen brought the neighborhood together in a way I hadn't seen in years. For once, it wasn't just the usual cluster of retirees and rule sticklers showing up. It was young parents, new homeowners, even the quiet ones who normally kept to themselves. It was as if Karen's reign had been a pressure cooker, and her meltdown over the clubhouse incident had finally blown the lid off. People were angry, yes, but they were also hopeful. It was the first time they believed things could change. The HOA board had always felt like some unapproachable inner circle, impossible to challenge, unmovable in its pettiness. But now the walls were crumbling, and the person everyone had feared was retreating into irrelevance, one cardboard box at a time. Candidates for the vacant seat included Zoe's mom, a former school administrator, Sarah, the current board secretary who'd been instrumental in exposing Karen's abuses, and a retired firefighter named Thomas, known for fixing neighbors' sprinklers for free. It was a good group. No one power-hungry, just people who wanted fairness, structure, and common sense. I stayed out of the campaign, though several neighbors asked if I consider running. I politely declined. My hands were already full with a state-level mess or two, and besides, I had no interest in micromanaging someone else's flower pot. But I did attend the debates, watched how the candidates handled difficult questions, and offered quiet support from the sidelines. I didn't need to lead. I just wanted the HOA to stop being run like a personal fiefdom. In the meantime, Karen tried one last stunt. Just days before the election, she filed a complaint against me with the state ethics board, claiming I had abused my power to retaliate against a private citizen. Her filing was full of exaggerations and omissions, leaving out key facts like the security footage, the police report, and the mounting evidence of her financial misconduct. She painted herself as the victim, a brave volunteer targeted by a vengeful politician. It might have been laughable if it weren't so audacious. I didn't respond publicly. I forwarded the complaint to my legal team, and within a week it was dismissed for lacking merit. The board reviewed the timeline and determined that all actions taken were legally sound, properly documented, and fully within ethical boundaries. But Karen's desperation didn't end there. She began contacting sympathetic neighbors, spinning a sob story about being driven out by a mob. A few of them, mostly her former inner circle, started parroting her talking points at meetings. They claimed the community had been manipulated, that the real issue was political targeting, not negligence. It didn't work. The majority of residents had seen enough. They remembered the fines, the threats, the arbitrary citations. They remembered the locked door and the crying children. Karen's supporters quickly found themselves outnumbered and increasingly isolated. Even Durek, who had once kept his head down during her power plays, now spoke openly about how Karen had bullied her way into every decision. Then came the audit result. The independent team concluded that Karen had misused over $18,000 in HOA funds over a 3-year period. Some of the most egregious charges included spa visits labeled as community wellness, a set of patio furniture she installed in her own backyard under the line item outdoor seating pilot program, and frequent food delivery charges during her volunteer Clubhouse hours. Worse, she had been fining residents under fake violations, made up rules she'd never submitted for board approval. There were emails in which she openly mocked homeowners behind their backs, referring to one elderly man as Old Yeller and another mother as Miss Pinterest Psycho. The audit report was published and made available to every household. It was a community bombshell. Suddenly, even her last few defenders stopped speaking up. The night of the election arrived like a neighborhood holiday. People came out in folding chairs, brought snacks, even wore campaign shirts. A sense of unity and healing filled the air. When the votes were tallied, Sarah won by a landslide. She took the microphone, visibly overwhelmed, and thanked everyone, not just for voting, but for showing up. "We took our neighborhood back," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's never go back to silence again." The applause went on for nearly a full minute. People weren't just clapping for her. They were clapping because they finally felt heard, because the clubhouse, once a symbol of pettiness and control, had become a rallying point for something better. A week later, Karen officially moved out. A moving truck arrived early in the morning, and by sunset, the porch that had once displayed laminated warnings about mailbox color coordination was empty. I stood on my own porch with my coffee, watching quietly. She didn't make eye contact. She got into her car and drove off without a word to anyone. No farewell, no apology, just the grinding noise of tires over gravel. I wasn't expecting closure. People like Karen rarely offer it. But her departure felt final, like a long overdue breath of fresh air. The moment her car vanished around the corner, I turned to go back inside, where my kids were baking cookies with Vanessa and arguing over sprinkles. In the days that followed, new policies were enacted swiftly. The HOA board established a complaint transparency system. No longer would vague warnings show up in mailboxes. Every citation would now include the rule, the evidence, and an appeals process. They also created a rotating volunteer committee so that no one person could hoard control over clubhouse events again. And best of all, they passed a new rule. All board members would be subject to yearly audits, with their financial handling reviewed by a third party. No one clapped louder at that announcement than Thomas, the sprinkler guy, who'd once been fined $75 by Karen for hanging holiday lights too early. I had one final encounter with Karen, though she didn't know it. A few days after she left, I received an anonymous email with a photo attachment. It was a screenshot from a local real estate app. Karen's new home had been listed under a private LLC. I recognized the address immediately. It was in a neighborhood where the HOA was optional and mostly ceremonial. No fines, no board meetings, just a newsletter about lawnmower safety once a year. It made sense. She'd finally moved to a place where she had no power to abuse and no audience to fear her. I clicked the photo closed and archived the email. That was the end of it, at least for me. But the kids didn't forget. A few days after Karen's departure, the neighborhood held a picnic at the now reopened clubhouse. Ellie ran up to me holding a cardboard sign she made with markers and glitter. It read, "Now safe for kids." She taped it on the inside of the clubhouse door with pride, then ran off to join Max and the others playing tag. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sign. It was crooked and messy and perfect. I hadn't needed revenge. I hadn't needed drama. I just needed peace. And thanks to 2 brave kids, a few angry parents, and the unshakable truth that peace had finally arrived, life in the neighborhood settled into something resembling normalcy, though with a few notable upgrades. The clubhouse, once a symbol of rigid control and favoritism, now buzzed with community events run by volunteers who actually listened. A new set of rules was posted publicly, simple, reasonable, and written in plain language without legalese or threats of fines for trivial nonsense. People smiled more when walking their dogs. Parents let their kids play a little longer at the park without glancing over their shoulders. There was laughter again, not just polite neighbor chatter, but real joy returning to a place that had been stifled for far too long. It was as if the community had been holding its breath, and finally, it could exhale. My kids didn't say much about Karen anymore, but the effect of what happened lingered in small ways. Ellie started double-checking doors when she entered any building. Max insisted on keeping a flashlight in his backpack, just in case someone locks him somewhere dumb again. We didn't dwell on it, but we didn't ignore it either. As a family, we talked through fear and trust and safety. We reminded them that not all adults are right, and sometimes the ones in charge are the ones who need to be stopped. The lesson stuck, not in a way that made them anxious, but in a way that made them sharper, more aware, a little wiser than they had been before. A few weeks later, I got a call from the county prosecutor's office. They were moving forward with criminal charges after reviewing the final police report, security footage, and Karen's own statements. The charges included misdemeanor child endangerment, unlawful detainment, and misuse of community funds. Nothing extreme. This wasn't about locking someone in a basement, but it was enough to leave a permanent mark. A court date was scheduled, and Karen was summoned to appear. I wasn't required to attend, but I did anyway, not out of vengeance, but because I wanted to close the loop. Court was quiet, sterile, and dull, the opposite of the dramatic stories people imagine when they think about justice. Karen sat at the defense table, her posture stiff, wearing a blouse that tried to scream professionalism but couldn't quite drown out the desperation in her eyes. She pleaded no contest to 2 of the charges and agreed to a deferred sentence. That meant community service, mandatory ethics training, a formal apology to be read into the public record, and a ban from holding any HOA or civic leadership position for the next decade. As far as punishments go, it was light but symbolic. She had been stripped of her power, and now it was official. When the judge asked if the victim's family wanted to make a statement, I stood. I kept it short. I said, "My children were frightened and forgotten, and that is something no parent should have to endure. This isn't about political power or personal revenge. It's about trust. The moment you hold a key to a building used by children, you carry a responsibility far heavier than that keychain. You broke that trust. The community will heal, but your actions won't be forgotten." Karen didn't look up once. The courtroom was still. The judge nodded, made a note, and the gavel fell. Just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters lingered, but I declined to comment. The real story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to a community that had stood up and reclaimed itself. Karen's downfall wasn't caused by one person with a legal title. It was caused by dozens of neighbors who finally stopped whispering and started acting. The mother who'd been fined for sidewalk chalk, the elderly couple whose yard decorations had been removed, the man whose mailbox paint color was deemed visually aggressive. Each of them in some way had contributed to the tipping point. I had simply held the door open for the truth to walk through. A month later, the new HOA board surprised my family at the community potluck. They'd put together a little ceremony, not formal, just heartfelt. Ellie and Max were called up to receive what they called courage pins, tiny golden keys that symbolized the moment they didn't panic, didn't cry for long, but instead reached out and asked for help. The board also unveiled a plaque mounted on the newly repainted clubhouse wall that read, "In honor of every child who reminds us that safety and kindness must always come before rules." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't political. It was perfect. Vanessa took a photo of Ellie standing beside the plaque, pointing at her name with a smile big enough to melt concrete. Max kept twirling his key pin like it was a medal from the Olympics. In that moment, I knew it had all been worth it. Every meeting, every report, every quiet strategy to keep things lawful and precise, it all led to this: peace. Not just for us, but for every family who had felt helpless under the weight of Karen's absurd control. The final twist came just a few weeks after the potluck. A neighbor who worked in real estate casually mentioned that Karen's old house had been purchased by someone relocating from the capital. I didn't think much of it at first, until I got an invitation to lunch from my deputy director. He was moving into the area and had just closed on a new place. The address made me chuckle. Karen had unknowingly sold her house to a high-ranking official from my own office. When I told him the story over burgers, he laughed so hard he nearly choked on a fry. "So I'm living in the house of a disgraced former HOA tyrant," he said. "You're going to have to let me host the next office barbecue." We made plans for it, and that summer, my team gathered at the very property where so many ridiculous rules had been written. There were no clipboards, no laminated notices, Just kids running through sprinklers, burgers on the grill, and laughter echoing off the clubhouse walls. Karen's ghost had been banished, not with rage or chaos, but with something far more powerful: accountability and community. As the sun set, I watched Max teach a younger kid how to use a foam water rocket, while Ellie organized a game of freeze tag. Vanessa nudged me and said, "You know they're going to tell this story one day, probably with more drama than it had." I smirked and said, "Let them. As long as they remember who to call when things go wrong." And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Titles, power, rules, they mean nothing if they aren't wielded with care. It's not about being the attorney general. It's about being the kind of neighbor who doesn't walk past a waving hand in a window. It's about showing your children that silence enables bullies, and that truth, when spoken clearly and calmly, will always be louder in the end. So no, Karen never came back, but the community she tried to control came back stronger than ever. And the clubhouse, well, now it's got better locks, better lighting, and a sign in the corner written in big colorful letters by Ellie herself. It says, "Kids welcome, Karen's not."